Alright guys, so in this video we're going to discuss how to install Debian. Now I know I've done installation videos in the past. I think the last one I did was probably covered either Wheezy or Jesse maybe. I can't really remember how far back that one goes. So this is going to kind of update that, and it's going to show off some new features in the installer. Because while most of what the prior video may have shown is probably still relevant, it's definitely dated. So it'd be nice to update that, and I'd like something that sort of fits in better with the series and is kind of designed for this series so that we all come up on the same page if you're trying to follow along. So I guess the first thing I want to show you guys is how to obtain Debian. Probably the best place to start, I would think. So you go to debian.org. There's the URL up there in the browser. And what you're going to do is you could click on this download Debian, but you'll get what's called a network install, which means you'll get a very slim, lightweight installer that is not complete. And if you don't have access to the internet, you'll come up with like a blinking cursor. It won't be a full desktop operating system. It gets those packages from the internet during the installation. It's really, really great if you want to make a lightweight installer, but it's also bad if you want to install multiple times, because then you got to pull the packages from the internet versus having them right there on the disk or media. So there are ups and downs to doing that. So what you may want to do instead is grab the Getting Debian link here, and then scroll down to where it says Complete Installation Image. Now you can just go straight to these torrent images here if you want to do a torrent. Actually doing the torrent is beyond the scope of this particular video, but if you do click one of those links, go for the AMD64 one, unless you have a kernel that is a 32-bit kernel. I'm betting most of you guys out there will probably want the AMD64 image. You're going to go for this AMD64 DVD1 ISO.torrent image and just download that, load it into your BitTorrent program, let that DVD download, and you'll get that ISO, which is a disk image of your installer. You do not necessarily need the other two images. They're basically more for like a fully offline system. So if you have a system that is completely offline and you don't want it to ever access the internet, having those DVDs just gives you the rest of the repository, access to packages you may not otherwise have. But generally they're not needed if your computer is going to be internet equipped, because you'll just download them from the normal repository and they'll be more up to date anyway over time that way. So if you want to download a standard image without using torrents, which I advise you, if you can figure out how to do it and you have a BitTorrent client on your computer, use the BitTorrent method if there's nothing barring you from doing it, because it's easier on the Debian servers that way. But if you require it, go to the complete installation image, click on download CD DVD images using HTTP, and then go to official CD DVD images of the stable release. You can grab testing if you choose, but this video and this series is only going to generally cover the stable release. And if you are new to Debian or Linux in general, I highly recommend staying stable. You'll have a better experience. Generally speaking, you won't have as many problems and hang-ups with your system if you stick to stable. So in the stable, you'll see there's a whole bunch of architectures that Debian supports. You'll see there's a CD and DVD version of the image. If you only have a CD-ROM or CD-ROM burner and that's all you're going to be able to install with, by all means go for the CD image. But if you have the capability of getting the DVD and you don't have like bandwidth issues or whatever, grab the DVD image. It's a little bit better. There's more packages on it, etc. and so forth. So just do the AMD64 image unless you need the i386, which is the 32-bit image. So generally you'll only need that if your CPU literally does not support 64-bit. So if it's really old. Any newer computer should run the 64-bit image. And even if you think to yourself, well, I need 32-bit packages for such and such reason, don't worry. run the 64-bit image anyway, because later on I will show you how to enable the 32-bit architecture if you require it. So once you're here, you're going to scroll down. You're going to find the Debian 9.5.0 AMD 64 DVD 1.is or TAC1.iso image here. 9.5 as at the time of this video, obviously. That may change in the future. And you're going to download that image. Once you have it on your disk, you either use some CD burning software or some sort of CD-ROM writer, read-write software to burn the disk from the ISO image, and that should give you a bootable disk media. If you're like me and you prefer a bootable thumb drive, you can use, if you're in Windows, either Rufus, which is a tool that you can use to turn an ISO into a bootable image for a USB thumb drive, or you can use UNetbootin, which is the other solution, and this one's good for Mac and Linux as well, although in Linux there's really not much of a need for it. There's another trick that I'll show you probably in a later video for how you can burn or create bootable USB thumb drives without having to use any kind of software like this, and you can do it straight from the command line. So that's up to you. It's your choice how you want to do it. I do remember people telling me that UNetbootin was ill-advised for Debian, but that was years ago, and I'm not sure if they've solved that or not. Again, your mileage may vary, and I can't guarantee for sure because I have absolutely no experience with it past, I don't know, quite a few years ago. I have not made a USB thumb drive from a Windows box in a very long time. But here are some screenshots of how to go through the process. So basically you're going to come down here and bullet your disk image, point your ISO using this ... It'll open up a file picker and you can pick your ISO that you downloaded out. And then you can point it at your CD or at your USB thumb drive. When you do this, be extra careful that you don't point it at something you don't intend to overwrite. So just make sure you know where you're writing your image to. It'll look like this once you get it all set up, except it'll say Debian instead of Ubuntu, unless you downloaded Ubuntu instead. And this bit here is Ubuntu only, so this space preserve files across reboots or whatever, that is Ubuntu only, and you don't need to worry about it if you're using any other distribution. So no worries there. And here are screenshots of it running in Mac and what appears to be an Ubuntu installation given the color scheme, but that's clearly a Linux image there. So once you've got your USB thumb drive made and it's bootable, go ahead and plug that into your computer, and we'll begin working on formatting your system. So basically, once you get your system all set up and configured to accept the disk, which if you're using a laptop or a desktop, you're going to need to probably tap escape, F1, F2, sometimes F8, F10, F12. So I've even seen it beat the delete key from time to time. You can look usually on the bottom of the screen during the boot process. It'll flash it up there real quick. You'll need to be fast and interrupt the boot process. There may be a way in Windows 10 to actually tell the computer to shut down and reboot into the boot menu, but if there is not, then just try to interrupt the boot process as best you can. You may need to refer to your computer's documentation, either the documentation that came with your motherboard if it's a custom build, or the documentation that came with your laptop or desktop PC if it is a store-bought machine. So just try to look that up and figure out what your system will take. So this is going to be the virtual machine that I will use. This video will not cover the process of setting up a virtual machine. That's kind of up to you. So I hope that you know how to use VirtualBox, or in this case I'm using Virt Manager and KVM because it's a Linux-based virtual system. Also VMware works just fine too. You can use any one of those to do this and experiment with Linux. I'm not going to do this on real hardware just because that would be very painful to try to set up and record. So, you know, setting these up are fairly straightforward. They're not too terribly bad to figure out. So just follow the documentation, the directions, and get it set up. Provision about 10 to 20 gigs, depending on how much you want to do with the system. I've left myself 20, but I've got a 2 terabyte hard drive in there, so it's fine. In your case, feel out how much storage you're going to need. I would not, in any circumstances, go lower than 8, though. Just to give yourself some room to install some things and play around, especially if you're going to do a GUI. I would try to stick with either 10 or 20 if possible. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and start this virtual machine up, and you should see it pop up to a menu that looks sort of like this. If you have done things correctly. Or you may get a menu that looks, you may go into like the BIOS or the EFI configuration utility or whatever. If you go in there, you're going to look for your boot setup. It should be, like, there should be a menu that says boot, and then from there you can rearrange your boot order. I would be more specific on those instructions, but unfortunately from system to system they are vastly different sometimes. So what I tell you on one may not necessarily apply to the other, and that's really unfortunate, but hopefully you can get that figured out. So at this point I'm just going to press 1 here to boot from the CD-ROM. This is going to bring up the Debian installer, and for the basic installation video we're just going to target the Graphical Installer. I'm not going to go into any of the other menu options here, so just hit the Graphical Installer and you should get that menu that will pop up. Just give it just a second here. And when we get to the parts where we're on load bars and stuff, I'm probably going to just pause the video and forward through it. Just an FYI there so that you understand that, the load bars aren't instantaneous, obviously. I just don't want to make it painful for you guys to watch. So choose your appropriate language. For me, that's obviously English. Your location, what keyboard mapping you want to use. Just pick the settings that are relevant to you. For me, it's just all the defaults, so that's good. And then it's going to go through this like loading components process. It's fairly straightforward. And it's basically going to just load all the different programs and things that it needs in order to run the installer properly, is what it's doing. So that's going to detect the network hardware. So at this point is where you might see a prompt that says that you need a driver for your wireless card if you're doing this on a laptop or something that has a wireless card that isn't supported by the open source drivers. If you get that prompt, just ignore it. We'll take care of that once we get into the OS. Hopefully you can use wired internet if that does happen to you. If not, then you'll need to download the driver manually and install it manually in .deb format, which I may cover in a later video, but in this one, not so much. So for the host name, you can make it whatever you kind of want. I'm just going to call it, I don't know, Debian GNOME test VM. Yeah, that works. Debian GNOME test VM, because this one is going to be a GNOME installation. So let's go ahead and continue that. The domain name can be whatever you want. You can even just leave it blank. It depends. If you have a domain name, put it in there. If you don't know what a domain name is, you can just leave that field blank. Okay, so this is your root password, and this is one of the misconceptions about Debian that I wanted to cover. So there are people who say, and I've seen this in a lot of different places, so if you thought this, don't feel bad, because I see it all the time, but I just want to point it out because I think it's interesting. So in Ubuntu, if you install an Ubuntu system, it sets up a program called sudo, which basically allows, it's like saying please. It gives you elevated privileges for that one command that you run, right? It's like running things as root. So if you're new to Linux, what is the root account? The root account is like the administrator account in Windows. It's sort of like Linux God mode. If you have that account, you can do anything you want to the system, including delete all the files on it, whatever you want. So it's important to protect that particular account. So what you need to know here is that Ubuntu tends to set up a program called sudo and disables the root account by default. So you can obviously configure Ubuntu to give you normal access to the root account by setting a password and all that later. But if you just walk through the installer, you'll get sudo, and your admin account, your first account that you set up, will be joined to that group, so then you can use sudo to run commands as the administrator, which is essentially what sudo is. It's like saying run as administrator. So there are people who seem to think that that's not the behavior that the Debian installer has. They think that you set the root password here and it doesn't set up sudo, but that is not true. And those people are skipping past this page without really taking it in. So if you read the third paragraph here, the root user should not have an empty password. If you leave this empty, the root account will be disabled and the system's initial user account will be given the power to become root using the sudo command. Basically, if you leave these password fields blank, then it will set it up as the Ubuntu installer normally would. But if you fill in a password, then it enables the root account and does not install sudo. So that is sort of, the truth behind this prompt here is that you get the choice. It's just not obvious if you blow through the installer and don't really read all the stuff it tells you on all the pages. And that's fine if you don't. I'm guilty of it as well. I didn't actually know this until somewhat recently, but it is the case. You can set it up either way. And actually, because it is more difficult to go ahead and set up sudo later, because you have to actually install sudo and then you have to add users to groups, just set up sudo now. It'll make things so much easier. And then if you want the root account to be enabled later, you can just give root a password and it'll be enabled. So let's go ahead and do that by clicking continue and not putting a password in. See, the installer is easier now. So now we're going to make a first name for the new user. This will be the primary user on the account, and we'll just call him admin. You can obviously call him whatever you want. You know what? Why don't we use my own name? I'm used to my own name. We'll call him Joe. Joe's awesome. We'll be Joe. All right. So this is the username for the account. So the other name was like the full name where you do capitals and you can do like your first name space your last name or whatever. This is like your real username. So it needs to be all lowercase and all one word. Now you're going to set a password for your user account. We're going to go with password because we're fun like that. So password it is. All right, now we're going to set a time zone, so choose what's appropriate for you. And it's going to detect the disks. And it's going to set us up with the partitioning scheme here. Okay, now if you are a very, very new user, there are different scenarios here that you need to be aware of. Okay, so guided use entire disk. That is the normal standard way to set up a disk on Linux. Okay, so what that's going to give you is a standard construction file system that does not have logical volume management. Okay, guided use entire disk and set up logical volume management is really, really good if you're going to be expanding your hard drives later. If you see yourself adding a disk and expanding it, or trying to make your partitions take up more disk space. And if you don't know, if you're a new user, a novice, and don't know what I'm talking about, that's perfectly fine. You can safely tune it out. But if you are interested, guided use entire disk and set up LVM is a good idea if you want to give yourself some flexibility in how you use your disks, because basically you can do what's called like a software RAID, where you can take two disks of even varying size if you want and make them look like one big disk to your system, and several other different tricks like that. It just gives yourself your system more flexibility. And then the last option is guided use entire disk and set up encrypted LVM. So what that's going to do is it's going to give you a layer of encryption called using a program called Lux that gives you the full disk encryption. You're going to have an extra password to enter before you boot your system up by default if you set that up. So be aware of that. However, you could also use a key-based method on a more advanced installation. So after you set up your encrypted volume, it's possible to then set up like a micro SD card, or I don't know if an YubiKey will do it or not. I haven't tested with that, but like a micro SD or a thumb drive or something, and then you can put a key on there, like an encryption key, and it will allow you to log into your laptop as long as that stick is in there, and if you pull it, then it won't be able to boot up anymore. So that is up to you if you want to try something like that. That is obviously beyond the scope of this video. For the sake of argument, we're going to set up an LVM in this video. If you're using a laptop that only has one hard disk and it's not expandable, you're not going to ever replace it or anything like that, or if you are going to replace it, that's not a big deal. The point is you're not ever going to add anything to it, and you're not going to want to move storage around or whatever later. Just use the guided use entire disk. If you are on a desktop and you're going to be installing new hard drives and adding stuff to the system, LVM is the way to go. We're going to do LVM here simply because I want the LVM enabled so that later on in the video series I can start demonstrating LVM for the more advanced users. So we're just going to click continue. We're going to choose our virtual disk that I set up for this, which has 21.5 gigabytes of storage. So click continue on that. Now, here is where you can set up what's called partitions. So if you're a new user and you don't understand what partitions are, basically they are segments of your disk that you can dedicate to different things. It is normally good practice to set up a different partition for each of your, for certain areas of your system. So separate home, var, and temp partitions. And you can test out whether or not the structure that it grants you when you do that is a good idea. I don't necessarily tend to like it by default the way it lays it out. I think it gives too much storage to home and too little to other places. But you can feel that out whatever you feel comfortable with if you're a more advanced user. What I'm going to do is I'm going to check all files in one partition in this particular case. And I'm going to say yes to write the configuration changes, write the changes to the disks and configure LVM. So what this is going to do is it's going to give me an ext4 partition on an LVM, and it's going to give me a swap partition on an LVM, and that's perfectly fine. We're just going to leave it like that. And then this is going to be the actual hard disk. And so this is the primary partition with the boot volume on it, because that needs to be there. And this is the logical partition, which is the LVM partition. So this is a partition upon which these LVM partitions live. So it basically creates a layer of abstraction between the disk and the logical volumes themselves, and sets it up in such a way that if you want to expand those volumes, shrink those volumes, add a new volume, create another disk, add it to your group, whatever, it makes it really easy and flexible to do that. But for the sake of simplicity, for now, we're going to go ahead and finish this off. In later videos in the advanced series, I'm going to show you guys how to, on a live system, fix this so that the partition table looks more like what you would see on a traditional Linux system. But new users should probably keep it simple until they get their feet wet and understand what they're doing a little more. One other thing I want to note here, though, is if you are setting this up as a system for you to live in, it might actually be a good idea for you to go ahead and configure your home partition to be on its own, to configure your home directory to be on its own partition. So basically, if you set up LVM to separate out the home volume, that might be a good idea. And the reason why is if you wreck your system, you can actually format it and fix it, and your home partition can be not touched in such a way that if you have a whole bunch of files that you've been saving on your system, you don't have to worry about them getting destroyed during the formatting process. So if you can figure out how to do it, separate those partitions out. Probably the easiest way to do it is if I go back and select partition disks here. No, actually, yeah, do guided. Okay, yeah, so choose guided partitioning at the top, and then you can switch it up by choosing the LVM again, the virtual disk again, and then here you can separate the home partition like that, and then choose yes, and then choose yes. So separating the home partition will look more like this, which is actually a really good idea. And in fact, I think I'm actually going to change course and actually go with this because now that I think about it, as a new user, if you brick your system, having your home partition separated like that will allow you to format root without formatting home, allowing you to fix your system without losing your data. So let's talk about what home actually is, because I think that may be lost on some users what root and home are. Root is like the top level of the directory tree in Linux, so you can think of root as everything. And home normally will hang off of root if you don't section it out like this, and it's still going to hang off of root, but in this configuration, home is going to have its own storage allocation, straight up dedicated to home. And what's really cool about this is that it has two major advantages. The first one we've already talked about. If you break your system and you need to format root, you don't have to format home as well, so you don't risk data loss. The other good thing is if home gets full, it won't affect root, so you won't have weird things like you can't log into your system because your disk is full. It sort of creates a layer of protection around root, which is a good idea. So you can think of the home, I mean, I'm sure you probably kind of understand what home is, but the equivalent to it is like the user directory in Windows. So like, was it C:users or C:documents and settings as it used to be, I think, back in the day. I think now it's just C:users. That is the equivalent to the home directory in Linux. It's where all of your personal files are going to go, and if you're not root, that is where everything you touch lives, including your system configuration settings for your user account. Anyway, now that we've got that, let's go ahead and hit finish partitioning and write changes to disk. And we'll go ahead and hit yes to confirm we want to do this. This is the point of no return. Once you hit this button, you cannot undo it, whatever it is you're doing. So be very, very careful and make sure you understand what you've done and ensure that you're not clobbering something or overwriting something that you need. Because once you hit this button, you're gone. And now it's going to install the base operating system. And I'm going to go ahead and pause the video so you don't have to watch it. Alright, so now that that's finished up, you should see a prompt that looks much like this. This is basically saying, do you want to scan another CD or DVD? If you remember, there were disk sets that you could download. You downloaded one. If you downloaded 2 or 3, you can hit yes here and point it at that disk by inserting it into your system. And that will allow you to scan that in so that you can use it as a repository for your computer to install packages from. If you don't have that disk, that's perfectly fine. If you're using a net install, don't worry about it. If you're using a USB thumb drive installer, you probably shouldn't worry about it. Just click continue. And this is where you're going to tell it to use a network mirror. And so basically if you have the internet or internet access, you're going to want to bullet yes here, and then you're going to want to hit continue. Tell it which part of the world you're in, and choose a network mirror that's close to you. I like dev.debian.org, but you can choose whatever one you want, and then hit continue. This is if you have an app cache server on your network. I actually do have one of those, but I am not going to fill this in here. If you don't fill it in, don't worry about it, just leave it blank. Most installations, you should just leave it blank. An app cache server basically allows you to cache the apt packages that come down. So basically, when your computer reaches out to the internet to get the packages from the repository remotely, say updates for instance, what's going to happen is if you have an app cacher, it will cache them locally on your network. And then if you have multiple Debian systems on your network, then they can reach out, and instead of going all the way out to the internet, they'll go to the caching server and pull the packages from there, thus making installations and updates much faster on subsequent systems as you install them. So it is a good thing to have, and I may cover it in a future video, but in this video we're just going to leave it blank. And we're just going to wait for this guy to configure apt, which should happen shortly here. Hopefully it's not too bad. Doesn't look it. Okay, so now it's going to do the select and install software portion. I'm going to go ahead and pause it, and I will unpause it when it comes time to pick software. Okay, so this is if you want to participate in the package usage survey called Popularity Contest. You can determine if you're going to do that or not. That's up to you. In this particular video, I'm going to select no because this is a demonstration system and the data wouldn't be good anyway, I don't think. So we're going to click continue. Alright, so this is where we're going to select the packages that we're going to install for our system. So here we're going to pick our desktop environments. If you just check the very top one, you're going to get GNOME anyway. But I'm going to bullet GNOME just for good measure. If you want additional ones, you can check them off as well. If you want to install an alternative one, you can check off that one and uncheck the rest. So if I, for instance, uncheck GNOME and check KDE, I will only get the KDE desktop. Or I could check them both, and I'll get both GNOME and KDE. For this demonstration video, I'm going to set up GNOME, and the reason I'm going to set up GNOME is because I already have a VM pre-prepared that has KDE on it. So, it just makes sense to do GNOME in this case. But what you should know about the other ones there that are listed, you can absolutely use them, and I encourage you to do so. But if you're new and you're trying to follow along with this tutorial, all of the GUI configuration stuff that I'm going to show you will be more applicable to GNOME or KDE. I cannot guarantee they will work appropriately in XFCE, Cinnamon, Mate, or LXDE. Also note that there are other options beyond these here. Budgie, for instance, can be installed on Debian Linux. It's just not listed here, but you can grab the packages. If you're going to do that, I recommend installing it alongside GNOME or one of the GNOME-based ones like Cinnamon or Mate. I think it's called Mate. Although you would be, I guess, technically okay saying mate. I think I'm not sure. But anyway, if you're gonna do that, that's beyond the scope of this video. If you're completely new and don't really know what you're doing, I highly recommend you stick to either GNOME or KDE, or both, but preferably one or the other because installing both is very heavy. Also note that if you uncheck both GNOME and the Debian desktop environment like this, you're going to end up with a very Spartan system that will be more akin to what we're going to do in the server video. So just bear that in mind, that if you uncheck everything like that, you're going to end up with a terminal and that's it. So That's important to note, I suppose. However, if you want to use alternative window managers and alternative desktop environments that are not on this list, that is a good method to install them cleanly in a way where you don't have other desktops alongside them if you just want to do, you know, just that one. So like Awesome Window Manager, for instance, is your thing, that's how you would get that. Here you can set up a print server if you have a printer and you want to use it. You can also set up an SSH server on the system. I'll go ahead and set it up, why not? And also you want to check standard system utilities. So after you make your choices for what you want here, just pick continue. And after you click continue, you're going to play the waiting game because we got about 1,478 packages here to install. And this whole 12 seconds remaining is kind of deceptive because that's just retrieving them. It's going to go through an installation process in a minute here. But as you can see, it does move along pretty quickly. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video so that you don't have to stare at it moving along quickly, and we can, you know, I'll unpause it when it comes time to do the next screen. Okay, so now we're looking at the next screen that we have some options on. This is going to allow us to install the Grub Bootloader, or the Grand Unified Bootloader as it were. And basically you'll want to do this. This is a piece of software basically responsible for starting your computer up. So you're going to need to do this. So just bullet yes and click continue, and then you're going to want to select the disk that you will be using, which should hopefully be on this list. You can enter it manually, but hopefully it's on the list. If you do have to enter it manually, it will look something like this. Chances are yours may be Dev SDA, or if your computer's really old, HDA. It's VDA for me because I'm running a virtual system. And once that's done, which it should be done in a few seconds here, it's going to tell me to reboot the system. And that's it. So now at this point I can hit continue, and it will finish out the installer and reboot. And it looks like it's going to the boot thing automatically, so let's go ahead and fix that. Reboot. Force reset. There we go. Escape. And I'll just tell it to boot directly from the disk. There you go. So that's the Grub Bootloader when it's running correctly. It's going to automatically choose to boot the selected one, and then it's going to come up to the Linux desktop for the first time. Don't worry about the LVM TAD thing. It's an error you could ignore safely. And there it is. So this is the GNOME desktop. And go ahead and log in. And let it go ahead and spin up our profile, and that's it. Now we have our GNOME desktop and we're good to go. That is a completed installation of Debian Linux. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned a lot. Stay tuned for the next one, which will involve a more advanced installation and will take us into a console-based operating system that will be used for the advanced videos. So yeah, stay tuned for that one. Thank you.